The Drug Enforcement Administration released its annual report recently with details about the growing fentanyl crisis. The administrator said in the report, and I'm summarizing, the current drug environment is the worst the U.S. has ever faced. All the traditional drugs you would think of remain a concern: cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, but fentanyl is now in the mix and it's wreaking havoc. Over 112,000 people died of fentanyl overdoses in 2023 alone. I know you're probably thinking this is a domestic concern, and so why does this matter to our podcast here? Well, let's talk about it. Welcome to this week's episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, John Mollick. As I mentioned in the intro, this week I want to shift focus to a domestic concern that originates from overseas and is directly tied to national security concerns, and therefore in our wheelhouse right here on the show. And that's the fentanyl crisis. Now, I try not to use hyperbole on the show because that's not my game. I'm not here to shock people and flood my commentary with adjectives that eventually lose their value. It's like the exclamation point in writing. I've read from multiple authors that more than one exclamation point per chapter of a book is too many. The fewer the better, right? So don't bury the reader, in our case the listener, with language that waters down your narrative. Anyway, I use the word crisis, and it's the reason I describe that, because that's what it is. You hear the word crisis in the media all the time, but it's there to just gather and gain your attention. But the word still has value, and here it does. 112,000 people overdosed from fentanyl in 2023. And as of right now, there's no end in sight that anyone can speak to, anyone that I've come across. And why would we believe differently? Why would we believe the numbers would drop next year? Given the roots of the conflict, I see the number either continuing to rise or at least remaining steady. And that's clearly unfortunate. So although I spend most of my time here on the podcast discussing foreign affairs and military conflict and then the histories thereof or histories on their own, I do have nearly 15 years of law enforcement experience as a narcotics investigator, technically an organized crime investigator, but most of what I did was in the narcotics world. And I've worked fentanyl wiretap cases in the past. As a matter of fact, I had one in particular, is the last case that I had while I was in my last profession. Was a fentanyl case that I was the affiant of. Plus, with fentanyl, this is a global issue with military conflict implications. It's not just a domestic problem. Nefarious actors in China and Mexico are tied at the hip in this fentanyl trade, and dealing with the problem involves many aspects of government, like law enforcement, border control, political diplomacy, intelligence collection, health services, economic sanctions, on and on. So there's a lot to talk about here. It's certainly a relevant topic for us here on the show, and we're going to get into it. Weekly caveat: although I remain in the business, I don't speak for the U.S. Army. I don't speak for the U.S. government. I don't speak for the Department of Defense. All of my opinions are my own, and I gather all of my information from open source repositories. Now, I'll also add the caveat this week: I do not speak for New York State, and I don't speak for the New York State Attorney General's office or its Organized Crime Task Force, because I'll be talking a little bit about my time there. So again, as it is in the military, I'm just speaking from my own experience, and my opinions are my own. So let me give you a little background on my experience that I just touched on, right? Just to give you a little context. So yes, I've been in the military intelligence field for 27 years, but 14 of those I served as a full-time organized crime investigator with the New York State Attorney General's office. So as a member of the National Guard, I could have 27 years of National Guard experience, with many years employed in a full-time status, but for a long time I was employed in just my part-time status and full-time as a civilian investigator with the AG's office, particularly or specifically in New York State. And within that AG's office, I worked for what we called the Organized Crime Task Force, where we investigated illicit organizations dealing with guns, drugs, gang activity mainly. Some of the cases involved, if you official gangs, if you can call them that, like the Bloods, who we had a set here locally in the capital region or the Albany area of New York, was tied into the national structure. But a lot of times the gangs that we were dealing with were local gangs and local to the cities here. Anyway, while we were working at the AGs, as we call it, we ran wiretap investigations, and that was mainly my job. Eavesdropping is the legal term. To identify and dismantle groups terrorizing our local cities, like I had said, Albany, but that includes Schenectady and Troy in here in upstate New York. Again, what we refer to as like the capital region. I started there in 2008. I was hired in June of 2008. I entered the police academy shortly thereafter and graduated in 2009, and that's when I started. That's when I started working these cases or cases like this right after graduation. And I remained in that position until 2021 when I left the Attorney General's office and I assumed the position I currently work in now full-time for the Army, doing intelligence work. So I've been an affiant 3 times when I was on the job, so which means in 3 separate large investigations, I swore to the facts of the case in front of a judge, and was also at the time the senior investigator for the case. Now, of course, we had supervisors, mine include police officers and attorneys kind of indirectly, although they weren't in what we would call our chain of command. We did have oversight from the attorneys, as you might imagine. But as an affiant, I had the responsibility of pointing the case in the direction you initially planned for. So every case has an initial concept. You have an idea of, especially cases as large as the ones that we did, where you have upwards of anywhere between 25 to 100 defendants at the end of your investigation. You had a goal for the case. It wasn't just a willy-nilly investigation. We'll kind of see where it goes. That often didn't happen. So as an affiant, I was responsible that when we all agreed upon, meaning multiple agencies working in one case, when we all agreed that this was the point of the investigation and we were trying to reach a certain end state, we were trying to arrest a certain individual up the ladder in an organization, whatever it was, that my job was to help keep us on that path. Unfortunately, given my time in this role, I also had experience with a lot of defendants, as you might imagine, and a lot of those that were addicted to the drugs that were being peddled in the investigations, right? So you have the high level and mid level dealers, people that are selling kilos and multiple ounces would be high and then mid, and then you have the individuals who are selling 20 pieces and 50 pieces, and 99% of the time the people that are selling that level of those amounts of narcotics are usually addicted to them. So it's, I got to see really the whole spectrum of those involved in these organizations, all the way down, to the addict level, all the way up to the individuals who are working with cartels that began out overseas. So I've seen the cost of drug addiction firsthand. I've listened to the phone calls of drug users selling anything that wasn't tied down in their house or their apartment or wherever they were just so they could buy some more crack. I've taken surveillance videos of females putting drugs in places that we don't want to mention just so they can transport those said drugs for boyfriends so they can smoke free crack or heroin or meth or whatever it was. So it's a tough business, and fentanyl is only making the problem worse. Fortunately, on the other side, I was never on the scene during an overdose, so I don't have that direct experience, although I was trained on how to use naloxone, which is the generic version of Narcan that is used to revive individuals who are overdosing from an opioid use. I never had to use it myself. I know plenty of people who did, though. But nonetheless, I've seen the full gamut. And I plan to do some episodes on topics like these in the future, specific to some of these cases and investigations and how they matter to our topics here that we normally cover on the podcast. But that's just the overview, just to give you an understanding of where I'm coming from and why I have the interest in talking about fentanyl and what it's doing to the people that use it. Okay, before we get into the what's and whys of the conflict itself, let's talk about the drug fentanyl by comparing and contrasting it to some of the other more well-known drugs. If you're not too versed in what fentanyl actually is and why it's different and why people are using it and why it's a concern, So let's compare and contrast. So first, it's a purely synthetic drug that's originally designed to relieve pain for the neediest of patients, typically like end-of-life cancer patients or those with the most serious trauma, like car accidents, near fatal car accidents, those type of things. Right? It's a very, very powerful pain reliever. It derives its lineage, if you can call it that, from the opioid family, and it is classified as an opioid, even though, as I said, it's synthetic and doesn't come from the opium plant like the other plant-based drugs, heroin and morphine. Right? It suppresses blood flow, reduces anxiety in the moment, relieves pain, just like the plant-based opiates, heroin and morphine, like I mentioned. However, it's generally like 50 to 100 times more potent. It depends on who you ask, but with potentially even the capability of being more so. And that's why we come across a lot of the overdoses. It's like its other opioid cousins, highly addictive. So given all that, it might make sense why drug users would have an interest in fentanyl, maybe because they've increased their tolerance over many years of heroin or prescription pill use. On the street, it can come in powder form, but mainly it also comes in pill, IV, nasal spray, and that's the kind of stuff. Those are the versions you would get in the hospital, but like I said, on the street, you can also get it in powder. It's typically gray. And so now you might ask, so why is it becoming so popular other than the fact that it's efficacious, right? It does what it's supposed to do. It can be made anywhere, practically. Plant-based opiates require, plants, which require land and natural resources and expertise to produce, and not any land is suitable to grow poppy plants, which is what you need in order to eventually produce heroin or morphine from the opium sap. So in talking about the plant-based opioids, the vast majority are produced in Southeast and Southwest Asia. I mean, Afghanistan, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, that's really where most of the opium, there's some grown in China, but that's the vast majority of where all of the heroin originates, heroin being the ultimate final product. But because those environments there, the terrain and the weather and the soil, they support poppy growth. And also the government control is such that it's just easier to grow large amounts. It would be hard to hide huge hundreds of thousands of acres of poppy plant growth in the United States or Germany or the UK or France, right? I mean, you're talking about areas that don't have centralized government control, and there's more regional control. You can even use warlord-like control if you're talking about Afghanistan, so it's just easier to grow. Anyways, fentanyl is purely synthetic. And so if you just have the right chemicals, a little bit of lab space, you can theoretically make fentanyl anywhere, right? Similar to methamphetamine. The chemistry is more complicated than it is with meth. So we don't see like vacation campers in the woods producing what is often called, like hillbilly meth. It's not my words, but nonetheless, it can be made anywhere if you have the right skills. So again, it's not necessarily being made by somebody in their basement. It's more complicated, but nonetheless, it doesn't require land. You don't require all the other things that poppies need. And that leads us to the point of the episode and why a domestic concern like fentanyl use and the sales and possession and then ultimately the overdoses is related to our discussions here on foreign affairs, because China and Mexico in particular have the expertise and produce and transport the drug that's flooding our streets. And China in particular is a country that we talk about often here on the show. And the problem just isn't here. Obviously, since I'm based in the U.S., that's my focus, but fentanyl is an issue for Europe as well. We aren't special here in the U.S. Unfortunately, and what's really scary, though, is Europe is dealing with an even stronger synthetic opioid called nitazene, which can be upwards of even 40 times stronger than fentanyl. And because of their strength, were never approved for medicinal purposes, even though they were first concocted in the 50s. So, nearly 100 years ago, nitazenes were discovered, they were developed, but never gained any use because they're just simply too strong. Fentanyl, morphine, and even heroin was used for legitimate, licit reasons for years, but they were considered enough. Now, nitazenes, in the difference between Europe and the U.S., they haven't really caused much of an issue here in the United States, although the DEA does mention its presence, and it's referred to here in the U.S. as Frankenstein opioids, but Europe really has more of an issue there. And I can say that given how international trafficking works, my guess, and because I haven't really looked at the trafficking data recently in the last couple of years, is that nitazines are more likely produced closer to Afghanistan and Pakistan, because typically the heroin produced there ends up in Europe, where the heroin in the U.S. typically comes from countries further east. All right, so, and I'm going to explain a little bit about why that is the case. And so this is why we would see an increase in synthetic drugs produced in Afghanistan and Pakistan recently. And so why would you say that nitazines, which are in Europe more so than they are in the U.S., would have a closer relationship to Afghanistan and maybe Pakistan? The answer is the Taliban. Now, if there's one thing that the world appreciated about the Taliban when they were holding court in Kabul, unfortunately they are again, but was their ability to quash poppy production and therefore ultimately heroin sales. NATO was unable, when they were in Afghanistan, to keep the production low for many reasons, and I don't have time for today. But now that the Talibs are back, poppy production is way down. Let me hang here for a second to give you some numbers to help explain why I'm thinking this way and how much of a connection between the Taliban and opium production there is, okay? Now, I'll be using UNODC numbers, the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, because frankly, they are the best. They are the best you will get when looking at data from remote places like Afghanistan. In fact, NATO worked closely with UNODC to get a handle on the poppy numbers when we were there, because UNODC literally put researchers in the field and tried to get the most accurate data possible. It was never perfect, and we all admit that, but it's the closest anyone was going to get. I mean, there was some numbers from the CIA, and their data was typically accurate, but it wasn't comprehensive, just by the way that the CIA operates. So they were able to get some information, but it just wasn't enough. So anyways, just understand that UNODC is where you're going to go when you're going to get numbers as it relates to drug manufacturing across the world, outside the U.S. in particular. So let me give you the context. In the 90s, Afghanistan, on average, cultivated about 70,000 hectares of opium and produced about 3,500 metric tons of opium, right? Those are the average. Now, 1 hectare is about 2.5 acres. You want to do the math. And that was true for most of, or all through the 90s. In 2001, when Afghanistan got a little busy, the numbers dropped to practically zero. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is because of the NATO operations, but two, there weren't as many researchers around to gather the data. So it was hard to get a handle on what was actually happening in terms of opium, poppy growth and opium production in Afghanistan in 2001. Nevertheless, it was clear there was much less opium being produced in 2001 than it was after the 90s. Now, after the initial invasion, and when I say invasion, I mean when the United States and NATO went into Afghanistan in 2001, opium production skyrocketed to numbers the world had never seen before. And I mean that literally. I'm not, no stretch of the imagination here. A couple of years, 2004, 150,000 hectares and 4,000 metric tons. Later, towards the end of the 2010s, 270,000 hectares, 7,500 metric tons. 2017, 330,000 hectares and 8,800 metric tons. What do you think happened in 2023? The return of the Taliban? 20,000 hectares, less than 200 metric tons. So at its peak, nearly 1 million acres of land in Afghanistan was being used to produce opium. And today, it's fewer than 80,000. That, my friends, is what we call in the intelligence business a change. Anyway, we can do a whole separate episode on this, and we might, if we have the desire. Just shoot me an email if you want to talk more about that in particular. But do you know what doesn't change when production drops like that? Demand. Heroin, opioid users, they don't simply fade away when their supply dries up. They go elsewhere. Now, I looked at the data from Southeast Asia to see where there were any correlations, right? Afghanistan being in Southwest Asia. So I looked at Southeast Asia to see if there was an increase in their production to make up for what was the drop in Afghanistan. It's much harder to find data in these countries because there's been less of a focus for the last 20 years, as you might imagine, but there is some. So, and mostly a lot of it's from Myanmar, believe it or not. But without getting too detailed and boring, because there's a bunch of small countries and stuff, just understand opium production has risen somewhat in Southeast Asia, but nowhere near in the same terms, in terms of percentages, as Afghanistan has dropped, right? So Afghanistan dropped about 95% of its poppy growth and then therefore opium production between 2021 and 2023. 95% down. The equivalent numbers going up in Southeast Asia is around like 10 to 20%. So that tells us that Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, etc., they don't make up the slack. So why do I give you this entire breakdown? Because fentanyl is an opioid, synthetically produced. It's completely on the rise. And it makes sense that it would be if the vast majority of heroin production in the world comes from Afghanistan and its Southeast Asian partners. And the numbers for Afghanistan are drastically lower, and there's not enough keeping up in Southeast Asia. And the demand hasn't changed. So it makes sense that we have an increase in synthetic opioid use. And let me just draw back really quickly to the nitazenes comment that I made earlier. What I was trying to say was nitazenes are much more popular in Europe than they are the United States. And what I was alluding to was that the nitazenes that they're seeing in the UK and in Europe are likely being produced somewhere near Afghanistan and the Pakistan region, because that's where most of the heroin use, that's where most of the heroin product comes from that goes to Europe. Afghanistan typically feeds Europe's heroin markets, and Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Laos, like I've said, typically feed the American heroin outlets. So if you have an increase in nitazenes in Europe, you have an increase in fentanyl use in the United States, you can see where the differences in their originating countries would come from, and the reason why I would make that assessment. So again, to reiterate, major drop in plant-based opiates, and something has to replace that. Now, like I had mentioned earlier, because fentanyl production is more complicated than methamphetamine, you're not able to have a group of dealers, producers, sellers crop up in someone's backyard and producing basement methamphetamine. It has to come from chemists that have access to more volatile chemicals and a lot more of them. And so who's doing that? Afghanistan doesn't have the infrastructure for that. Well, what we're coming to learn is that it's organized crime, in particular in China. And Mexico is directly involved, specifically and almost entirely as it relates to the American fentanyl market. For obvious reasons, Mexico's right here. So there are super labs, the intel is telling us, in China and Mexico, helping to produce this fentanyl that's ultimately making to our streets. Massive chemistry production facilities that produce liquid fentanyl in China, who then ship the stuff into 55-gallon barrels to Mexico for final production into, like I was saying earlier, pills, powder, or even other liquid, just not as pure. Now, during my latter years on the job, when I worked a couple fentanyl cases, one of them in particular was a much larger one and one that I led, I was dealing with fentanyl in the pill form, mainly what we colloquially call blues. They were literally blue-colored pills made of pure fentanyl with a bunch of adulterants like aspirin. And when I say pure, I don't mean literally the whole pill is fentanyl. Clearly you would die if you took that, but I mean it was not mixed with other drugs. So it was pure, the drug that was in the blue pill was purely fentanyl, and then a bunch of adulterants to decrease its strength, and then obviously you'd have to have some type of substance to turn it into a pill, and that's why I say like aspirin, Tylenol. And these blue pills were being pawned off as OxyContin pills. And why is that the case? So as you're probably well aware, there's a pill addiction issue in the U.S., and although that's gotten better over the last few years with new laws, 5, 8, 10 years ago, pill addiction was a huge issue. It stemmed from diverted pharmaceuticals, doctors giving pills for pain relief, and ignoring the fact, not only the doctors, but the pharmaceutical companies ignoring the fact that these were addictive substances. And when it became more difficult to get your hands on diverted pills because of some of these new laws, remember, just because the supply changes doesn't mean that the demand does necessarily, that users were looking to heroin to get the same effect from what they were getting off of licit OxyContin pills and others like it. Now, what fentanyl producers have done, and again, fentanyl use has skyrocketed recently, mainly because of the reduction in heroin production, but it wasn't like fentanyl wasn't around at all. I mean, it did pop up 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago as another option, but not so much an option on its own, but a way to make the heroin that was being used more powerful. And so if you have someone who's, let's say as an example, someone who was addicted to pain pills, it's more difficult to find them. Now they've moved on to heroin. If you find somebody that's selling heroin that has fentanyl, tiny little bits of fentanyl inside of that heroin that you've just purchased, when you use that and you get a longer euphoria or a much higher, stronger euphoria, you're going to go back to that same heroin dealer thinking to yourself, they got better stuff, so I'm going to go there. Now, what does happen, though, is that when you really don't know what you're doing and you take liquid fentanyl and you add it to your heroin, or you take powder fentanyl and you add it to your heroin, it turns it a little gray, as I had said, but you don't know how to do it right. Let's say you're doing it in New York City or you're doing it in Mexico. You have no idea how to actually do it like a chemist would, say, from China. Then you end up killing your users because you have a significant amount of overdoses. So how do you get people to continue to use fentanyl, your product, and not kill them? What you do is you start producing fentanyl in pill form. One, because it's much easier. If you're working in a super lab scenario, it's much easier to get the amounts right per pill than it is for somebody to ad hoc add fentanyl to your heroin. And if you can make the pills look exactly like the OxyContin pills, then you can almost trick these pill users into thinking they're taking the actual pills and they're not even using heroin anymore. Because one of the things that addicts, as I've talked to them, one of the things that addicts will say is that it was one thing to be addicted to pain pills, but there was a classiness, if you will, to it. There was not as much of a fear because, and there wasn't so much of a social hang up because at least the pills were, prescribed by doctors and made in legitimate pharmaceutical companies, and they were very expensive. And so that's one thing. It's a whole nother thing to start, snorting dry heroin like you would coke on a Friday night at a party, or ultimately leading to shooting heroin, which most addicts end up doing if they start just by snorting. So if you can get them to go back to using pills, not only do you have a better chance of not killing your clientele, but you change the social and the cultural desire to use those pills. I can't recall how many phone calls I took listening to dealers trying to convince buyers that the pills that they had, these blues, blue 30s, they would call them, the 30 milligram, quote unquote, 30 milligram oxys, right? That they were actually oxys and they weren't, fake fentanyl pills, because that was the whole draw. So producers in China, they start to understand this, and they say, let's ultimately get this initial fentanyl production that we have here in China, let's eventually get that into pill form, which they do in Mexico, and get those pills by the millions into the United States, and we can continue to grow our business here, if you will. So how does this happen? So in China, it produces the fentanyl in liquid form. It has the labs, it has the precursors, it has the chemists. So they produce it in liquid form, which, and in such a potency that literally, if you came in contact with it, you die like instantly. It's the pure liquid fentanyl. And the reason that they produce it in liquid form and keep it in liquid form is because it takes less to ship it to Mexico. Right? If you were to produce produce the fentanyl in liquid form. Then you would have to turn it. You would have to take all of the steps, which we're not going to go through, but you take all of the steps to turn it into usable fentanyl. You need all of these other workers. You need all of these other locations. And then if you needed to convert it into pills, you need even more locations. And then the pills physically take up a lot more space than pure fentanyl does. So if you're looking to transport illicit substances from the Pacific to Mexico, then you're going to do it in liquid form and then let the Mexican cartels deal with converting it into the next step. So they do the same thing in Afghanistan. When you take the initial poppy harvest and you get the initial form of opium, it needs to be dried in a solution, which then concentrates. You need to do that on a 10-to-1 scale. So they do that in Afghanistan. So when they transport the 10-to-1 scale product, there's 10% of the same stuff that you need to move across the border. It's just less stuff. So it makes it easier to transport. Same thing happens in China. They have the pure fentanyl liquid there. Eventually they move it to Mexico. It's less stuff to move. A higher concentration, fewer shipments. Fewer shipments meaning lower chance of getting caught. That's why the fentanyl that's being used here is not being produced start to finish in China. Start in China, finish in Mexico. And then what's obvious is that when the fentanyl makes it from China into Mexico, the Mexican cartels, which already have an established base here in the Western Hemisphere, they get it across the border. Okay, so that's the issue with fentanyl here in the United States. There's a drop in plant-based opium production, increased in synthetic. They have the capability to do it in China. It's moved to Mexico, and we're seeing it here on the streets of the United States. So let's talk about who's to blame. Who are we looking at as the problem? Some of it we've talked about. But first, let's understand that addiction is the first issue, and it's one we can't do much about. And when I say that, I mean it's simply who we are. Humans have a propensity for addiction, some more than others, whether it be gambling, booze, dope, whatever. Addiction is a part of who we are. And as long as we have users, we're going to have dealers. Like any other commodity product in the world, it's all based on supply and demand. And as long as there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. Can we make it better? Can we look at the addiction problem and try and reduce its effects nationally? Sure. Look at cigarettes. Fascinating to me to see how few people actually smoke today as compared to when I was a kid, when there were ashtrays in cars and airports, right? When doctors would smoke. Clearly, we've established, at least in the United States and in Europe, we've established organizations and processes to try to reduce tobacco addiction, and therefore less people smoke. So it can happen, but you're never going to eradicate it. Same with the other substances. So addiction in this sense, it's no one's fault, but it is a fact of life that needs to be considered, right? If you're going to talk about why we're having fentanyl overdoses in the United States, we can't just blame everybody who's selling it. We're going to have to attack the problem from the user side as well. We are, but it's half the issue. But for our purposes, in terms of direct responsibility, China, like I had said. And when I say China, I am including the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the ultimate point of this episode. If we look at Mexico, we don't fully blame the Mexican government for the drug problem in the United States. Right? We understand the Mexican government's limitations, how the government actually works. It actually works very closely with our military and law enforcement to tackle these cartel problems. It's not perfect. Of course, there are corrupt actors. But all in all, the Mexican government isn't full throttle bombarding the U.S. with, fentanyl poison, as some may even assume. It's not the case. You can do plenty of reading on how the Mexican government, as imperfect as it is trying their best to help us with these issues. It's just a plain fact that the government doesn't have the proper resources to fight the cartels. The cartels are well-funded, well-armed, and they cause big issues for Mexico. They cause issues for the Mexican government and the Mexican people themselves. It's not just the United States. So let's not go too hard on the Mexican government in particular. The cartels are the biggest issues. And we know that, right? The United States has invested millions and millions of dollars for years in what we call the war on drugs for 50 years now. And really the war on drugs was a term that came out of the Reagan administration. Unfortunately, now let me say here about the war on drugs, parenthetically, working in the field for nearly 15 years, I work some with amazing professionals that work hard every day to keep our streets safe and clean, particularly from drugs. And I've known friends who have even given their lives to doing so. I've still never met one who said, boy, we're really doing a good job and we're winning the war on drugs here. I've never met a DEA agent, a local detective, HSI, troopers, whatever, that's made that claim. It's a challenge. But anyways, back to the China-Mexico. China is different. Yes, there's Chinese organized crime. And yes, there are places in China where the government has less control than they do in the cities. But many reports over the last couple of years, and some recent ones have come out, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, is actually talking about this in particular, in testimony to Congress, have indicated that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is aware of the production and it doesn't do much about it. You're talking about a society that scans people's faces on street corners so they can monitor social standing, and they put that data into countrywide databases. Don't tell me that that's the government that doesn't have a handle on what's going on in its country. Aside from that reporting, too, indicating the CCP's tangential involvement, remember that private companies do not exist in China in the same way that they do here. So, and this is to just bolstering my argument here, nothing happens with any, quote, private company without the CCP's approval. Nothing exists unless it supports the party in some way. Look at TikTok. We've talked about this. We should all know by now that TikTok, through its parent company, ByteDance, is taking all the user data that they can from all the users across the world for the good of the CCP. I mean, the United States is taking a drastic, unheard of step in banning a company as popular as TikTok because of what they know China is doing, the CCP is doing with the data behind the scenes and how much they're lying. If the CCP wants the data, they're taking it. That's all that matters. There is no separation in our typical understanding of public and private. It's all one in support of the party. So then you ask yourself, well, taking TikTok data makes sense, but why would the CCP be in the business of selling opioids to Americans and Europeans? Right? It's one thing to try to influence an election. It doesn't really kill anybody. Maybe you get some political wins, but I mean, selling fentanyl is a whole different world. But first, a couple explanations. First, what you have to do, though, is you got to move your moral guidepost. You have to shift your thinking about what you would consider right and wrong in order for this to make sense. All right? So shift your moral guidepost here. The first thing why the CCP would be involved, they make money. It's really that simple. I'm not saying the CCP has public institutions that have been designed directly to produce fentanyl to sell to the United States. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that the private firms, these quote private firms, organized crime, gangs, whatever it is you want to call them, they do their business in China, and the Chinese government looks the other way. Maybe the business pays them a couple of bucks. Right? Is that a good way to add to your tax base for a communist-like, I shouldn't say communist-like, it is a communist, socialist-based economy? You need more money? Yeah, you got a bunch of people selling a bunch of stuff to the United States. Maybe it's not a good idea, but if I look the other way, I can make some tax, increase my tax base. Not bad. But the second point is ideologically, and that's why I said you had to shift your moral compass, right? I mean, it seems rather unbelievable, but if you're thinking in the way that the CCP thinks, it's different than, say, the government in Paris, okay? Second, and ideologically, it helps create and cause chaos within society, which is a tactic not only of China's, but of Russia's in terms of international diplomatic and military policy. And by chaos, what I mean is helping to push the idea that democracy is a failed political system. And that's not even something that China hides, right? That they talk about that openly, that democracy is bad and communism is good, right? They're very proud of this. So if in America, if you have an election trust issue, if they have a loose cannon in the White House that China is looking to support, if the United States that has a drug problem that's killing hundreds of thousands of people, if the United States is having race riots, that makes America look weak. and out of control. And it makes democratic institutions look ineffective. These are wins for China and Russia, as an aside. So back to the moral guidepost, you say, would a government really turn a blind eye to overdose killings for their own gain? Yes. Yes. And the CCP is doing just that. So this is clearly a complicated topic. I mean, there are so many different avenues that we can take with this fentanyl crisis in terms of the addiction problem. Is the law enforcement response, the quote-unquote war on drugs, really working in the way that it should? Should the United States switch to some of the European models like Portugal in terms of the legality of drugs? I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying it's an option. Then you're talking about the border crisis and how the border is open, so that's just making it more easy for fentanyl to make it across the border from Mexico once it's finalized in the labs there. I mean, there's a whole host of tangents we can go on here, but the particular one of interest, like I said, is the whole fact that the CCP, although maybe not directly involved, the fact that they have to know that this is happening and they're using it as part of their military and diplomatic tactics is concerning. China really wants the American people to lose faith in their institutions. And they're doing this all in preparation for the time that we potentially go to war. They don't want a strong, proud, competent society behind the United States and the decisions the United States government makes in the event that China takes Taiwan in whatever year that they do. Right? And again, and as I said on the show before, I'm one of those that holds the belief that they will someday. Last episode, Lieutenant Colonel Sean Tabankin repeated a few times that China is not an enemy, but right now it definitely is a competitor, and he's right. You know, an enemy is like North Korea, right? Well, at least the regime in North Korea. We don't compete with them in any way, and they practically want us removed from the earth, right? The United States is an ultimate devil. We don't want that for China, and China ultimately doesn't want that for us. No one's advocating for the complete eradication of China as a country, and China's not doing it for the United States. But what they want to do, though, is they want to be stronger. Right? They want to be richer. They want to have more influence than us. They want to control their region of the world in their hemisphere, the South China Sea. They want to reunite Taiwan with the mainland, which they believe is their right to do. And they have a different moral compass, and they've decided to use different tactics in order to accomplish those missions. Well, so what do we do to stop it? Great question. We're just going to have to continue to do what we're already doing. We're going to help with the addiction issues where we can. No one's changing the concept of the war on drugs, so we're going to continue to work narcotics investigations the best way that we can to try and reduce the influence of the cartels that are affecting the U.S., and we're going to continue to use diplomatic and political pressure on China, which is likely the most effective way going forward, in order to get them to stop. What I mean by that is, like, as an example with TikTok, right? I mean, we're going to use political and diplomatic channels to remove TikTok from the United States. That's going to try and change Chinese behavior. Calling out the CCP and declassifying, if you will, information that we have that ties the CCP directly or indirectly into fentanyl production in China and releasing that to the public puts pressure on the CCP because they lose then legitimacy in the international community. There's a lot of people that think that China is no better or worse than, a global influencer than the United States. But if you can go ahead, if the US or Europe or whatever can produce information that says, well, I mean, maybe you think China's great and all, but look at what they're doing with fentanyl, it reduces their moral standing. So we're going to have to continue to do the same things we can now. We're not going to go invade China. We're not going to go in and blow up their fentanyl labs where we know that they are, right? I'm sure the NGA is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is quite aware of what is happening in China. Let's just say. So we're not going to go in there and blow them up. We're just going to have to continue with our political and diplomatic discourse. But just understand that China is using all levers that it can to derail U.S. progress and reduce our influence across the world. Okay, so thanks for joining me this week. I hope you learned a few things about the law enforcement world and the narcotics world and what China's doing to influence all of that. As always, if you want to reach out to me, you can. John Malik at headlinesandhistory.com. You can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, John Malik or Headlines in History. Certainly feel free to send me any suggestions or questions, concerns about anything we're talking about here, even some topic ideas that you may want to discuss going forward. Like I had mentioned earlier in the episode, if you want a little bit of history on the whole heroin production in Afghanistan and how that came about during the invasion and what it might mean going forward, just let me know. I look forward to talking to everybody next week. Thanks again. Talk soon.